My daughter and her husband took everything I had to give, smiled while they did it, and then told me I'd outlived my usefulness. They said it on a Tuesday. By Friday, they were leaving voicemails that sounded like people drowning. I didn't answer a single one. Let me back up. Before we get into all of it, please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me what time it is, where you are right now. I read every single one. I retired from 31 years of electrical work on a Thursday in October. My knees had been telling me to quit for 2 years before that, and my back had been saying the same thing for 3. I didn't listen to either of them until the doctor made it less of a suggestion. My wife, Lorraine, had passed 4 years earlier. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the end. And by the time I handed in my union card, the house we'd shared in Columbus felt like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. I couldn't bring myself to move them. My daughter called on a Sunday night in March, 8 months after I retired. She has a way of opening conversations that makes you feel like you've already agreed to something before you understand what's being asked. "Dad," she said, "we've been talking, Raymond and I. We think it would be really good for everyone if you came to stay with us for a while." I asked what a while meant. She said, "Just come see how it feels." Her name is Becca. She was 34 then, living in a 4-bedroom house in Tempe, Arizona, with her husband Raymond and their 2 boys, Owen, who was 6, and Caleb, who was 4. Raymond worked in sales, traveled Monday through Thursday most weeks. Becca had stopped working when Owen was born and hadn't gone back. She was sharp, organized, good at making things sound reasonable that weren't entirely reasonable. I drove out to Arizona in April with my truck loaded and Lorraine's reading glasses wrapped in a dish towel in the glove box. The first year was good. I mean that genuinely. Owen and Caleb were at ages where a grandfather was still magical. Someone who knew how to fix things, who told stories that didn't involve screens, who had patience that parents running on empty didn't always have. I picked them up from school 3 days a week. I helped Raymond re-roof the back porch over a long weekend in June. I fixed the drainage issue in the side yard that had been causing problems since before I arrived. I paid for the groceries every week without being asked. Becca would say things like, "I don't know what we did without you, Dad." Raymond would clap me on the shoulder and call me a lifesaver. I believed them because I wanted to. By the second year, things had shifted in ways I kept explaining away. Becca stopped including me in dinner conversations. Not rudely, just I would say something and she would nod and then redirect to Raymond, and whatever I'd said would dissolve, like it had never been spoken. Raymond started coming home from his trips later. Some weeks, I wouldn't see him at all between Sunday night and Friday afternoon. The boys were in school full days now, so the pickup routine had mostly ended. I was still there, still paying for groceries, still handling whatever broke or leaked or needed attention. But the warmth had cooled to something more like tolerance. I still cooked dinner most nights. I still mowed the lawn. I still woke up at 6 to make sure Owen didn't miss the bus. I told myself it was just the rhythm of family life. Peaks and valleys. Every household had them. Then Owen started 3rd grade, and Caleb started 1st, and both boys were gone from 7:30 until 3. Raymond's company had shifted him to a regional manager role, which meant he was home more, but in his office more. Becca had joined a gym and a book club, and was talking about taking an online certification course in interior design. My usefulness, in the specific ways they needed it, had quietly expired. I noticed it the way you notice a slow leak, not all at once, but through accumulation. The sighs when I used the kitchen in the afternoon, the way Becca would walk through a room I was sitting in without acknowledging I was there. The time I overheard Raymond say from the other side of their bedroom door, "I just feel like we can't have a conversation in our own house anymore." And Becca's response, I know, but what are we supposed to do?" I didn't sleep much that night. I spent the next 3 weeks telling myself I was misinterpreting, that it was stress, that everyone goes through periods of friction. I was 67 years old, and I had loved my daughter for every one of those years, and I did not want to believe what the evidence was showing me. Then I flew back to Columbus for a week in October, to handle some paperwork with my accountant, and check on the house I still owned and had been renting out through a property management company. The tenants had moved out, and I needed to assess what updates to make before finding new ones. I was gone 7 days. I came back to Tempe on a Wednesday afternoon. My bedroom door was open. The room had been cleared out. Not packed. Cleared. My clothes were in 2 garbage bags in the hallway. The books I kept on the small shelf by the window were in a box with the flaps left open. The framed photo of Lorraine and me on our wedding day, the one I'd hung on the wall the first week I arrived, the one I looked at every single morning, was sitting face up on top of a garbage bag with a crack in the glass from where it had been placed carelessly. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, not moving. Becca came out of the kitchen. She was holding a coffee mug with both hands, and she looked at me the way you look at someone you've been rehearsing a conversation with for days. "Dad," she said, "we need to talk." Raymond appeared behind her, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. He didn't meet my eyes. I said, "What happened to my room?" Becca set her mug down on the hallway table. "We've been doing a lot of thinking while you were gone, Raymond and I, and we think it's time for you to find your own place. You've been here almost 3 years now, and we really appreciate everything, but we need our space back. We need to be our own family unit." I looked at Raymond. He looked at the floor. "My own place," I said. "You have resources, Dad. The house in Columbus. Your retirement. You're not without options. You cleared my room while I was in Columbus. We wanted to start fresh." I heard myself ask the question before I decided to ask it. "Is this about money?" Something moved across Becca's face, just for a second. "Of course not," she said, "but I had spent 31 years reading job sites and figuring out what people weren't saying. You learn to read the pause before the answer. You learn what 'of course not' sounds like when it means something else. How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "We're not planning anything, Dad. We need this." Raymond finally looked up. He said, "We really are grateful for everything you've done for us." He said it the way people say things they practiced in front of a mirror. I picked up the garbage bags with my clothes. I carried them to my truck. I made 3 trips for the rest of my things. Becca stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. Raymond had gone back into his office. I put the cracked photo of Lorraine on the passenger seat. I drove to a Hampton Inn 6 miles away and paid for a room with my credit card. I sat on the edge of the bed and I didn't cry, but it was a near thing. Outside, Tempe was doing whatever Tempe does on a Wednesday afternoon in October, completely indifferent to the fact that my daughter had just packed my life into garbage bags while I was 1,000 miles away handling paperwork. I ordered room service. A burger and fries I didn't finish. I watched the news without hearing any of it. Then I opened my laptop. Here is something Becca did not know, because she had never asked, and I had never volunteered it. The house in Columbus that I'd been renting out for 3 years was not my only financial asset. Lorraine and I had been careful people. We'd lived below our means for 3 decades. I had a 401k I'd barely touched, a pension from the union, and a brokerage account that Lorraine had managed with a quiet brilliance that I hadn't fully appreciated until she was gone and I saw the statements. I was not a man without options, but there was something else, something that Becca had apparently not looked into carefully before deciding I was a bag of clothes in a hallway. The house in Tempe, the 4-bedroom house where Owen had his Lego sets and Caleb had his drawings taped to the wall and Raymond had his home office, was leased. I knew this because Becca had asked me 2 years ago to help her find a better deal when their original lease was up. The landlord, a man named Phil Garrett, who lived in Scottsdale, had been raising the rent incrementally, and Becca had wanted to push back. I'd gotten involved, called Phil directly, had a long conversation with him over 2 separate phone calls. At the end of it, Phil had agreed to lock the rate for 2 years with a modest increase at renewal, and the lease had been signed. In my name. Not because anything underhand had happened, just because I was the one who'd handled the negotiation. Phil had directed the paperwork to me, and in the business of getting it done, No one had looked closely at whose name was on the signature line. Becca had signed a co-occupant form. Raymond had signed one too, but the primary leaseholder, the person Phil Garrett would call if there was ever a problem, was me. I had not thought about this in 2 years. It had not seemed relevant. It became relevant on a Wednesday night in a Hampton Inn in Tempe, Arizona. I called Phil the next morning. He remembered me immediately. We talked for a while about nothing important. His daughter's soccer season, the heat, how the rental market had changed, and then I explained that I was transitioning out of the property and needed to understand my options regarding the lease. Phil pulled up the file. He confirmed what I already knew. "You're the primary leaseholder," he said. "The renewal comes up in 6 weeks. You want to let it run out?" I thought about garbage bags in a hallway. I thought about a cracked photo and a door that had been open when it should have been closed. "I won't be renewing," I said. "I'll notify the other occupants that they'll need to make their own arrangements." Phil was quiet for a second. "Everything okay over there?" "It will be," I said. I spent the rest of that morning in a coffee shop with my laptop, making arrangements. I found a long-term extended stay hotel that ran week to week and had a small kitchenette. I booked 2 months. I called my property manager in Columbus and told him to hold off on listing the house. I had a feeling I'd be heading back sooner than expected. Then I wrote a brief, factual letter to Becca and Raymond, informing them that, as primary leaseholder, I would not be renewing the lease at the end of the current term, and that they should begin seeking alternative housing at their earliest convenience. I had it sent by certified mail that afternoon. After that, I drove to the hotel, checked in, and turned off my phone. I left it off for the first 3 days. When I turned it back on, there were 42 missed calls. 28 from Becca, 9 from Raymond, 3 from Becca's mother-in-law, who I'd met twice. 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Raymond's sister. 1 from a man I assumed was a friend of theirs who left a voicemail saying he thought there must have been a misunderstanding. There had been no misunderstanding. I listened to the voicemails in order. The first ones from Becca were controlled, tight, the kind of careful that takes effort. "Dad, call me back. We need to discuss this." Then, "Dad, this is not funny. Please call me." Then, somewhere around message 6, "I don't understand what you're doing. This is our home." And then later, her voice starting to come apart at the edges. "Dad, Owen is asking where you are. Please just call." Raymond's messages started formal and got smaller as they went. The last one was just, "Please, we have nowhere to go in 6 weeks." I sat in my kitchenette and I drank coffee, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was tired. Not satisfied, not triumphant. Just tired. The way you feel after something you've been holding up for a long time finally gets set down. I called my accountant in Columbus. I called the property manager. I booked a one-way flight home for the following Monday. I did not call Becca. She found out I was leaving when the front desk at the extended stay hotel told her I'd checked out. She'd apparently driven there in person, which was something I discovered later. By then, I was already at the airport, reading a novel I'd bought at the terminal bookstore, waiting for a boarding call. The flight home took 4 hours and 14 minutes. I watched the desert give way to flatlands, give way to the greens of the Midwest, and something in me that had been wound tight for 3 years began, very slowly, to loosen. The house in Columbus needed work. The tenants had been decent, but decent and careful aren't the same thing, and there was a long list of small repairs that had accumulated in a way that only becomes visible when you're standing inside the empty rooms. I spent the first 2 weeks handling the most urgent items myself: a cracked tile in the bathroom, a gutter that had pulled away from the fascia, a kitchen faucet that had been dripping long enough to leave a rust stain in the sink. I'd done harder work than this for 31 years. At night, I cooked real meals for the first time in months. I ate at the table where Lorraine and I had eaten for 2 decades. I put her reading glasses back on the nightstand where they belonged. The certified mail had apparently landed hard. Becca called every day for the first 2 weeks. The calls came in clusters, early morning, midday, evening, as though she was testing which window might find me more vulnerable. I let all of them go to voicemail. When the voicemails filled up, she switched to texts. Some of them were angry. "Do you understand what you're doing to this family?" Owen cried for an hour when I told him you weren't coming back. Some of them were practical in a way that felt calculated. "We have found a place, but we need another 30 days. Please just respond." Some of them were the kind of thing that's hard to read even when you know exactly why it's being sent. "I know I didn't handle things well. I know you didn't deserve how we handled it. But please, Dad, we need more time." I read every single text. I want to be honest about that. I didn't dismiss them. I sat with them. I thought about Owen and Caleb. I thought about whether I was being fair, whether what I was doing was about justice or just about being hurt. What I kept coming back to was the Wednesday afternoon. My clothes in garbage bags. The cracked photo. The practiced speech. The way Raymond had looked at the floor instead of at me while his wife told me that my season of usefulness had ended. They hadn't asked me to leave because things were difficult. They'd asked me to leave because they had concluded, at some point over the preceding year, that I was no longer worth the inconvenience of my presence. They had waited until I was 1,000 miles away, and then cleared my room, because that was easier than looking me in the eye while they did it. I was not going to pretend that hadn't happened. I texted Becca once, 2 weeks before the lease ended. I told her I understood they'd found a place, and that I hoped the transition was manageable, and that I was glad the boys had somewhere to go. I told her that when things had settled, if she wanted to have a real conversation, not about the lease, not about logistics, but about what had happened and why, I was open to that. I told her I still loved her. That hadn't changed. She didn't respond to that message. She sent 3 more logistical texts about the lease and then went quiet. The lease ended on a Friday. Phil Garrett sent me a brief email confirming the property had been vacated and was in acceptable condition. He asked if I wanted him to list it again. I said yes. I was sitting in the backyard in Columbus when that email arrived, the first cold evening of November, wearing a flannel shirt that had been Lorraine's favorite because she liked to steal it. The sugar maple in the corner of the yard had gone completely red. There was a cardinal on the fence, doing whatever cardinals do when they think no one's watching. 6 months earlier, I had driven to Arizona in a truck full of hope, believing my daughter needed me. She had needed me the way a person needs a good tool, specifically, until the job was done. But I was not a tool. I was a man who had buried his wife and retired from a life of honest work, and still had enough left in him to build something new if he wanted to. I had a house I owned free and clear, and a retirement account that Lorraine had tended like a garden, and an address book full of people who had known me before I was anybody's convenient grandfather. I called my old friend Dennis in late November, a man I'd known since Union days who'd retired to a small lake town in northern Michigan 3 years earlier. He had a guest room, a boat, and the specific kind of patience that comes from having survived his own share of family grief. "You want to come up for a while?" he asked. "Probably until spring," I said. "I'll get the room ready." I drove north on a Thursday in December with the truck loaded, and the Cardinals' fence post empty, and Lorraine's reading glasses in the glove box where they'd been since April. Becca called on Christmas Eve. I let it ring. She left a voicemail that I listened to 3 times, her voice careful and unguarded in a way it hadn't been for a long time. She said she'd been thinking about things. She said she thought she owed me an honest conversation, not a defensive one. She said she wasn't calling to ask for anything. I believed her, mostly. I called her back on December 26th. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. It was hard. She cried twice. I didn't, but it was closer than I'd like to admit. She didn't try to justify the garbage bags, or the cleared room, or the rehearsed speech. She said she had been so focused on what she needed that she had stopped being able to see what she was doing to get it. That's the truest thing she's said to me in years. We're not all the way back to where we were. I don't know if we'll get there. But Owen sent me a drawing in January, a man at a truck with a fishing rod sticking out the window, and I hung it on the wall in Dennis's guest room next to the cracked photo of Lorraine that I'd replaced the glass on, finally, at a frame shop in town. I'm not telling this story because I won. I'm not sure winning is the right word for any of it. I'm telling it because somewhere out there is someone who has been making themselves smaller to fit into a space someone else decided was the right size for them. someone who has been paying for the privilege of being tolerated, someone who keeps explaining away the evidence because they love the person showing it to them. I spent almost 3 years doing exactly that. The thing about being underestimated is that it works both ways. They see someone who needs them more than they need him. They forget to notice what he actually has, and what he can actually do, and how many years he's been doing it. I'm 67 years old, and I have a warm room in northern Michigan, and a lake that freezes solid in January, and a friend who doesn't need me for anything in particular except company, which is the only kind of being needed that I've ever trusted. My daughter has my number. I have hers. We'll figure out the rest as we go. If this story meant something to you, please hit like and subscribe to Pure Revenge Stories. Leave me a comment. Tell me what time it is where you are, and if any part of this ever felt familiar. To hear the next story, click the box on your left. Thank you for being here. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. Up here in Michigan, winter gives you that, whether you want it or not. The lake freezes over and the roads go quiet, and there's nothing to do in the evenings but sit with whatever's on your mind. What's on my mind most nights is cause and effect, not the dramatic version of it, not the idea that the universe keeps score and settles accounts on schedule. Just the plain, unglamorous truth that what we do to people accumulates. Every small dismissal, every sigh in a hallway, every choice to clear someone's room while they're 1,000 miles away, rather than look them in the eye. None of that disappears. It just waits. Becca is a smart woman. That's what makes it hard to explain, even to myself. She didn't do what she did out of cruelty. She did it out of a kind of moral laziness that I think is actually more common than cruelty. The laziness of deciding that someone's feelings are less important than your own convenience, and then not examining that decision closely enough to see it for what it is. She wanted her house back. She wanted her marriage to feel like hers again. Those are understandable things to want. The problem was the method. You don't pack a person's life in the garbage bags while they're gone. You don't rehearse a speech and deliver it to someone who loved you without flinching. And if you do, you don't get to be surprised by what follows. What followed in our case was simple. I had something she didn't know about. Not because I'd hidden it, because she'd never thought to ask. That's the thing about underestimating people. You stop being curious about them. You stop asking what they know, what they own, what they're capable of. You reduce them to the function they currently serve, and forget that they existed before you needed them, and will exist after. The lease was just a fact. I hadn't engineered it, but when the moment came, I knew what it meant, and I acted on it clearly and without hesitation. That's not cleverness. That's just what happens when you spend 67 years paying attention. I think about what I want Owen and Caleb to take from all of this, if they're old enough someday to understand it. Not the mechanics of it, not the lease or the certified letter or the 42 missed calls. I want them to understand that integrity is not just about how you treat people when it costs you nothing. It's about how you treat people when you think there won't be consequences. Becca thought there wouldn't be consequences. She was wrong, but more importantly, she shouldn't have needed consequences to treat her father decently. That's the part I hope they learn before they need to. Resilience, I've found, is not something you build in comfortable rooms. I built mine in factory hallways and hospital waiting rooms, and a Hampton Inn in Tempe, on a Wednesday night when I didn't know what came next. It's quieter than people expect. It doesn't feel like strength in the moment. It feels like just deciding to get up and do the next thing. Lorraine used to say that the people who love you well are the ones who keep showing up after they have no reason to. I think she was right. I also think the opposite is true, that you learn who people really are the moment they decide you stopped being useful to them. I learned that about my daughter on a Wednesday in October. I'm still deciding what to do with what I learned. The drawing Owen sent me is still on the wall. The man in the truck with the fishing rod, he drew it in blue crayon and signed his name in the corner in the big wobbly letters of a 7-year-old who is still figuring out how much space he's allowed to take up. I hope he takes up a lot. I hope he learns, earlier than I did, that a person's worth is not determined by how convenient they are to the people around them. I hope he's kind. I hope he asks questions. I hope when he's old enough to make the kind of choices his mother made, he makes different ones. And if he doesn't, I hope someone in his life has the clarity and the spine to show him, plainly and without drama, what those choices cost. That's all any of us can do for each other, really. Hold the mirror steady and let people see what's in it.